Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to today's Bridge event webinar, Equitable Access to Excellent Educators, State Planning Resources. I'm Reno Mackinnon, a researcher with REL West at WestEd here in rainy San Francisco. We're very lucky to have a great group of talented and experienced researchers and education leaders presenting today. Thank you all for joining us. I suspect most folks on the webinar are familiar with the Regional Educational Labs, or RELs, so I won't go into too many details, beyond saying that the 10 RELs are funded by the Institute of Education Sciences in the U.S. Department of Education to work in partnership with school districts, state departments of education, and others to use data and research to improve outcomes for students. This map shows the 10 REL regions. Today's webinar was organized by 3 RELs, REL Midwest, the navy blue region, REL Southwest in orange, and REL West in red, along with the federally funded Center on Great Teachers and Leaders. And here are our organization's logos, all quite snazzy. The REL work is today carried out under research alliances. Now, that's a type of research practice partnership in which a group of education stakeholders who share a specific concern work together to investigate a problem and generate solutions. Across the 10 RELs, there are 79 research alliances. Some of these are regionally focused, and some are topic focused. Given the topic's importance, all of the RELs involved today have an Educator Effectiveness Research Alliance and have been working with their states on the topic for several years. Here's today's agenda. First, we're very lucky to have Marianne Lemke from the American Institutes for Research, AIR, here to discuss the background and context of the current Equitable Access Initiative, including a review of the research base and policy context. Next, we will hear from several of the key leaders directing these important efforts in 2 states, Minnesota and Arizona. After hearing from officials in both of those states, we'll then have a 10-minute question and answer session. After the Q&A, Marianne Lemke will return to provide a brief overview of the technical assistance and support resources that are currently available to states. And Elizabeth Barkowski of REL Southwest will provide some examples of how RELs can help states incorporate data into their equity planning. Finally, we will share feedback surveys and adjourn for the day. Ensuring that all students have equitable access to excellent teachers is not only a nationwide priority, but it's also a federal mandate. Today's webinar will focus on state plans to ensure equitable access to excellent educators. The goal of this webinar is to engage in collective learning about how states are addressing equitable access and better understand the resources available to support work in this area. You'll see the intended outcomes are to become familiar with current research and strategies that are being employed to address equitable access, to become familiar with 2 states' approaches to increasing access to excellent educators, and to learn about resources available to support state-level work on equitable access. And as I said before, we're very lucky to have 4 talented state education leaders speaking with us today, and they're shown here. They'll be introduced in more detail prior to their presentations. But again, we're very excited to hear from them today. Marianne Lemke is a managing researcher at AIR, where she serves as lead and senior advisor on projects related to the use of assessment data and educator quality. She has more than a decade of experience managing large-scale survey and assessment projects, including investigations of principal evaluation and the conditions associated with effective school leadership, as well as direct work with several local and state education agencies. So welcome, Marianne.
Thanks very much, Reno. And I'm going to skip ahead since we've already talked about the agenda and just start by telling you a little bit about myself and the center that I'm representing, which Reno mentioned, which is the Center on Great Teachers and Leaders. So in addition to funding regional education laboratories across the country, the federal government also funds a number of content centers, and one of them is the Center on Great Teachers and Leaders. And that center is charged with providing resources and technical assistance to states and to comprehensive centers that also support states to improve educator quality across the country. We are also one of the several organizations that has been providing support to states specifically around equitable access to excellent educators through a network of organizations called the Equitable Access Support Network. And I didn't put the URL on here. I think that Jackie was showing it earlier, but I really encourage you to go to the GTL Center website, gtlcenter.org, if you're interested in learning more about the center. So I was asked to talk a little bit about the background and why we're having this conversation about equitable access today. And so I thought I would do a little bit of review of what we know about equitable access, and that'll lead us into our discussion of specific equity plans. So what do we know? Why are we having this conversation about equity? What we do know from lots of years of research is that there are gaps in access to excellent educators for different types of students. And over the past 20 to 50 years of research, we've seen these kinds of gaps in access to high-quality educators in a number of different ways. So we've used over the past years different measures to look at teacher quality and principal quality. Some of them relate to qualifications and attributes. So we might look at whether or not teachers are certified, their experience, even their college entrance exam scores, the selectivity of their colleges, and their education level. And you'll see cited here a number of the studies that have looked at these types of qualifications and the extent to which teachers with different types of qualifications and attributes are serving students in high poverty and high minority schools, and how that compares to the extent to which they serve students in other types of schools as well. Over the last few years, we've moved from looking at just teacher qualifications and attributes to also look at measuring teacher quality in different ways. And one of the ways that has been seen in the research over the last several years is teacher contributions to student academic growth, and these are typically measured through statistical value-added measures based on student test scores. And again, you'll see some of the studies that use these kinds of measures to look at educator quality. We've seen lots of different data analyzed to look at the issue of equitable access. So different studies have looked at national data, such as the Schools and Staffing Survey, a cross-sectional look at educator qualifications across the country. Other researchers have looked at state data for specific states using data from across the state. And other researchers have used data from specific districts to look at the extent to which students are being served by high-quality educators within a district. But no matter which data you use, no matter which types of measures that you use, we consistently see that there are gaps, that poor and minority students, and often low-performing students as well, we find that in the research also, are more likely to be taught by less qualified or less effective teachers, measured in many different ways, again, and using many different data sets. Even some of the more recent studies and the analyses that states have done for the equity plans that I'm going to talk about in a minute suggest that these equity gaps persist. And since a picture is worth 1,000 words, I thought I would just show you some of the findings from some of the research that's been done over the past years to show some of what these issues look like. And this is from one of the earlier studies, and it looks at data from New York City, and it looks at the average math SAT scores of teachers in New York City. And so what you see is that students in the highest poverty schools in New York City, their teachers on average have lower math SAT scores than students in the lowest poverty schools. And so you can see that that gap closes over the period of this particular study, which goes from 2000 to 2005. But by 2005, at the end of the study, that gap persists. So again, this is one of the earlier studies looking at one measure of teacher quality, looking at teacher college entrance scores. More recent analysis, and this one looks at data from across 10 districts around the country. And if you look at this analysis, This study was looking at teacher contributions to student learning to value-added scores. And so what you see, if you take an example of the middle school English language arts in the center of this diagram, what you see is that students in highest poverty schools, there are fewer high-performing teachers in those schools as compared to the lower poverty schools. So you see, for example, in the middle school English language arts, that 32% of teachers were classified as the highest performing, as compared to only 12% of teachers in the highest poverty schools. So this is one of the more recent studies. And then lastly, just to give a little bit of a different aspect to this, the question of equity. The previous two studies were looking at the extent to which students, poor students were taught equally by highly qualified or highly excellent teachers. And here we're looking at students in high minority schools as compared to schools with lower proportions of minority students. And you see a similar pattern to what we were just looking at previously, and this is using one state's data from 2012-13. And what you see is that students who are in high minority schools, this is just looking at the lowest percentage minority schools compared to the highest percentage minority schools in the state. And so what you see is that there are fewer highly effective teachers in the high minority schools as compared to those with lower percentages of minority students. So again, kind of no matter how you slice the data, no matter how you which data you're looking at, we see similar findings with respect to poor and minority students. So what's been the policy response to this? So if we know that there are gaps in equity and we know that these issues exist and that they persist, what can we do about them? So back in 2002, when the Elementary and Secondary Education Act was reauthorized as the No Child Left Behind Act, one of the things that law did was call for all students to be taught by highly qualified teachers by 2006. And this was at a time when we were really looking at teacher qualifications in particular and teacher experience. At that time, states were also required to specifically create plans that would ensure that poor and minority students were not being taught at higher rates than other students by underqualified, inexperienced, or out-of-field teachers. And you can actually go and see some of these plans back from 2006 online if you're interested. And they're still available there to look at. So if you fast forward to 2015, though, those plans from 2006 were developed, they were delivered, and some states updated them over time and continued to work on their plans for ensuring equity, and other states didn't do that quite as much. And so by 2015, the federal government thought it was an excellent opportunity to revisit the idea of ensuring equitable access to excellent educators. And so in 2015, the federal government again required states to develop plans to ensure that poor and minority students wouldn't be taught by less highly qualified teachers or less excellent teachers than students in other kinds of schools. And so what the federal government required of states in 2015 was that they develop a plan which would first look at the extent to which equity gaps persist with respect to poor and minority students. To look at the root causes of those existing gaps, if they're there, to design and describe strategies to address those root causes, and then to put forward plans to monitor and assess progress on reducing those equity gaps. And so as of earlier this year, most states have already submitted their plans. Some of them have already been reviewed by the federal government and been approved. And most of them are already posted online. So if you're interested in your state's plan or other states' plans, you can go online and have a look at those there. And what those state plans typically look like is they sort of tell a story of what's going on in that state. So for example, a state might find that students in high poverty schools are more often taught by inexperienced teachers. And so then the state would do an analysis often involving a stakeholder, a set of stakeholders, and sort of try to get at, well, what's the root cause of that? And so a state might say something like, well, we see that, we think that the root cause of having many inexperienced teachers in high poverty schools is that it's hard to retain those teachers. And so then you dig a little bit deeper and say, well, why is it hard to retain those teachers? Well, it's hard to retain those teachers because they really find it difficult to teach in that kind of environment. Well, why do they find it difficult to teach in that kind of environment? Because they're coming out of preparation programs and they're not well prepared for that specific kind of environment. And so you can see that it sort of tells a story, it tells you a story of why you see the equity gap that you see, and then the state would then use that information to develop a strategy to try to address the underlying causes of what they might think is going on in the state. So based on some initial analysis of the state plans, and it looks like the graphic here isn't quite showing up as it's supposed to. What we see is that indeed there are some common strategies found across states, and some of this analysis is continuing, but some of the more common strategies that states cited as using to eliminate equity gaps were focused on improving professional learning for teachers to help them be prepared to teach in particular kinds of schools or environments, improving educator preparation and certification programs, improving mentorship programs for teachers, improving educator evaluation systems, and supporting school leaders better. Those are just some examples of the types of strategies that states suggested they would be carrying out as part of their equity, as part of their follow-up to their equity plans. And so we're going to actually hear some examples of the issues and the types of strategies that states developed by hearing from a couple of state leaders about their equity plans. And so with that, I'm going to actually turn it over to my colleagues from Minnesota, Greg Keith, who is the Director of the Division of School Support, and Wei Nguyen, who is an Assistant Commissioner at the Minnesota Department of Education. And they're going to tell you a little bit about how they developed their plan and more specifically, some of the strategies that they identified to address equity gaps.
Hi, good afternoon, everybody. This is Wei Nguyen. I'm an Assistant Commissioner here at the Minnesota Department of Education.
And I'm Greg Keith. I'm the Director of the Division of School Support, as was already shared.
So we are here today to share Minnesota's plan, as we entitled the state plan, to ensure poor and minority students have equitable access to experienced, qualified, and in-field teachers. We just wanted to kind of take a moment to just share with you kind of Minnesota at a glance. So here in Minnesota, we have almost 500 public school districts and charter schools, a little over 2,000 K through 12 schools, 54,000 licensed teachers, 837,000 K through 12 students. And then we just wanted to provide you with kind of a breakdown of the demographics of what the students here in Minnesota. So about 70% of our students are white students, and then 11% are Black, a little over 8% are Hispanic students, 7% are Asian students, and a little over 2% are American Indian students. We have about 8% of our student population are English learners. Almost 15% are in special education, and 38.3% of our students are eligible for free or reduced lunch, and that percentage continues to increase every year. One thing that we did find useful when we were talking to stakeholders, and as we were kind of just looking at our own data, was looking at this heat map. This map shows you the percentage of students in poverty and where they are in Minnesota. Oftentimes, at least here in Minnesota, when we talk about poverty, people really concentrate on the metro area, which is kind of taken out on the side. Oftentimes, you know, we don't really talk about poverty that is in rural Minnesota, or we refer to it as greater Minnesota. So you can see that there are high concentrations of poverty also kind of in northern Minnesota and really kind of towards that bottom edge there. And then what I wanted to also point out to you are the red dots or the dots on the screen are all of our charter schools. So you can see that a lot of our charter schools also have high concentrations of students in poverty. And again, just to be clear, we defined poor or students in poverty as students who are qualified for free or reduced lunch. And then the next map we have is just showing you kind of where the concentrations of minority students are here in Minnesota. Again, oftentimes when we do talk about concentration of minority students, we do talk a lot about the concentration in our metro areas, particularly in our two largest school districts, Minneapolis and St. Paul Public Schools. But we do see concentrations of minority students, again, in greater Minnesota. And really when we dug into the data, those red spots that you see kind of in greater Minnesota are high concentration of American Indian students. And then as you can see among the dots, there are concentrations of minority students in our charter schools as well. So we wanted to just talk a little bit about the process in putting together our teacher equity plan. So when we got the guidance from the United States Department of Education, we immediately created a leadership team. And the leadership team consisted of people in our Commissioner of Education's cabinet, myself, the Assistant Commissioner, and our Deputy Commissioner, as well as directors in our agency, directors that are really experts in the field, Greg, working with our schools and supporting our schools out in the field, as well as our director of licensing that works a lot with licensing teachers, the data that's related to that we have on teachers and placement of teachers. We also had our data analytics team who really kind of crunched the information for us. We also participated in a lot of the meetings and webinars that were made available to us through institutions like GTL and AIR and Midwest REL. We actually had people come to Minnesota and walk us through a couple of different exercises, such as getting to root causes and initial strategies. They also helped talk us through what authentic stakeholder involvement would look like. We then created a stakeholder steering committee and a stakeholder advisory committee. The steering committee consisted of 24 stakeholder groups who were to provide direction and support to MDE as an agency as we put together the plan. This group helped review the data. They participated in root cause analysis exercises and helped to identify key equity gaps and strategies for closing the gaps. We then also convened an advisory committee. This was a larger committee in which we took kind of the information and the conversations that we had with our steering committee, and we asked them to review the data. We asked them to review the definitions, the root causes that we had come up with, some of the proposed strategies, and provide us feedback on the conversations that we did have. So the memberships of both the steering committee and the advisory committee consisted of educators, including teachers, principals, superintendents. We also thought it was very important to include parents, students, civil rights groups, education associations, higher education, and other school districts. And we really wanted to make sure that it was also very geographically representative of our state. So we made sure that we had both rural and metro representation on our group. Next, we also reviewed a lot of data. Fortunately for Minnesota, we do have a lot of data. So we reviewed state staffing data, teacher assignment data, K-12 enrollment data, and accountability data. And then finally, we submitted a draft of our plan to the Equitable Access Support Network, CCSSO, and we also asked our stakeholders, the advisory and our steering committee, to provide feedback of our plan. And we thought that was a great process, and I think that they thought it was a valuable exercise. Next, we wanted to talk about kind of the equity gaps that we did see as we were going through the data. Oh, I don't know if this is, it doesn't look like it is set up quite right. Okay, we'll just jump right into this. So the equity gaps that we identified were that schools in the highest poverty quartile and the highest minority quartile were more likely to have inexperienced, unqualified, and out-of-field teachers than schools in the lowest quartile. Our priority and focus schools were more likely to have inexperienced, unqualified, and out-of-field teachers than reward schools. And charter schools were more likely to have inexperienced, unqualified, and out-of-field teachers than non-charter schools. And through our exercises with our steering committees and our advisory committees, we identified the following root causes: ineffective leadership, inconsistent and ineffective induction and retention strategies, inconsistent and inequitable funding systems, barriers to licensure, and institutional racism. And throughout our discussions, it was very clear, and we want to emphasize that all of these root causes are deeply intertwined, and we believe that each of them influence a district or a school's ability to attract, train, and support and retain qualified, in-field, and experienced educators. So as we were working to develop our strategies don't just align to one of these root causes, they do align to several of them. So the 7 key strategies that we identified with our steering committee and our advisory committee was increase the focus on equity and provide technical assistance to schools and districts, provide support to identified schools and districts through the regional centers of excellence, integrate teacher equity into World's Best Workforce plans. World's Best Workforce is Minnesota's state accountability system, locally passed by our own state legislature, which emphasizes local goal setting, local conversations, and locally developed strategies. The 4th one was implement teacher workforce development strategies that support supply and demand needs. Strengthen teacher induction to support early career educators and those in career transition. Increase support for charter schools, particularly charter school authorizers. Oh.
It's got a mind of its own, doesn't it?
Study funding and resource allocation based on equitable access, schools, and district needs. Again, as I had mentioned, our proposed strategies seek to address multiple equity gaps and root causes. For example, strategy number 2 seeks to address all of the equity gaps that we identified and the following root causes: inconsistent and ineffective induction and retention strategies and institutional racism. And then I just want to say that when we were developing our strategies, we looked at creating new programs and policies, but we thought it was important to build on programs and strategies that are already in place and that we know are yielding results. So I'm going to kick it off to Greg, who's going to talk about strategy number 1.
So as was mentioned previously, one of the things that we really try to do is we try to look at successful existing work that we could build from, that we could align our teacher equity plan strategies and sub-strategies to. This definitely, along with strategies to, as was previously mentioned, really utilized our regional centers of excellence as really the delivery, and was really trying to build on what we were already doing in Greater Minnesota and in the metro area through our regional centers. So there were 5 sub-strategies underneath this strategy, all of them related to utilizing the regional centers, and built additional work for the regional centers. The other thing about this strategy, a reason why we chose this one to share, was because you saw the demographics for Minnesota's student groups, and definitely we're a state with a large white population and smaller minority populations. And through this process, so one of the things that really emerged was that many of our minority populations, our underserved populations, felt like they had never been invited to these conversations about equity and about racism. And so this strategy was really one that was of key importance to our steering committee and to our advisory committee. And it really reflects our belief that we have to have a larger conversation about equity and about racism in order to impact this teacher equity conversation, or this teacher equity gaps. That's just one piece of the puzzle, and it has to be a bigger puzzle if we're really going to impact the quality of education that all of our students receive, both those that have always been underserved and our white students. It's just one part. So full implementation of the strategy was embedded in a larger strategic plan to expand our regional centers. We had an $8 million expansion budget that really supported this strategy with its sub-strategies, and then strategy 2 as well in our equity plan, as well as expansion of the support that we offer to our low-performing schools. Unfortunately, we received $1 million per year for this biennium. So we also mentioned this strategy because we really had to look at our equity plan, and we really had to prioritize our sub-strategies and identify areas where we could use existing resources. We didn't want to just ignore and put off this important work, since to us, this strategy in particular is part of the larger equity conversation that we do with schools. So things we were able to do was we did continue the employment of 1 equity specialist within the center versus the 5 that we wanted. We did establish an equity work group that's made up of center staff that leads the work in the centers. Since we didn't have the capacity really to facilitate this statewide team, we did build a statewide team within the regional centers themselves to ensure that this work moved forward. We were able to dedicate some of the existing resources to provide professional development to the center staff, the second bullet. So we were able to move forward in that. And then really that 4th bullet, we had to do some extensive modification to. We identified ways that we could more aggressively pursue the equity work and the support that we already give the priority and focus schools, which is a lot of the schools that are in those quartiles that serve the highest proportion of minority students and poor students. So we do feel like we're having some impact on the gaps that we have by embedding it in the work that we're already doing, since we weren't able to expand as much as we had hoped for.
And I'm going to talk about strategy 4, implementing teacher workforce development strategies that support supply and demand needs. Here in Minnesota, we actually produce a teacher supply and demand report every 2 years, which shows the areas that we have teacher shortages, not just in licensed areas, but also geographically as well. So we use a lot of data from that report to help us come up with strategies to support teachers in the workforce. some of the sub-strategies that we came up with was improve teacher recruitment by providing financial support, improve hiring strategies by schools, streamline the process to obtain a Minnesota teaching license, make it easier for already licensed teachers to add teaching licenses, improve data collection, and strengthening training and cultural competence and responsiveness. We were fortunate in Minnesota that at the same time we were putting together our teacher equity plan, our legislature was also in session. So we were able to actually go and introduce legislation, again, as Greg mentioned, to ask for some changes and for some funding to try to successfully implement some of our sub-strategies. One example is that the governor approved and we introduced legislation for $25 million, what we called a teacher workforce package, to really get at improving teacher recruitment and providing financial support. This included a forgivable loan program for individuals who would go into the teaching field and would teach in a high needs area or geographic area for up to 4 years. We also had a grant program to help diversify our teacher workforce. And then another program that would have allowed already licensed teachers to get another license in a high needs area in some type of expedited process. The only thing that we did come out of this legislative session was about a $400,000 loan forgiveness program in which teachers will be able to apply for to have already existing loans forgiven. But, you know, we do think that that particular strategy is very important in helping to build and diversify our teaching workforce here in Minnesota. So it is likely that we will be asking for that in the upcoming legislative session. We have been able to make some changes in streamlining the process to obtain a teaching license. In Minnesota, all teachers had to pass a Minnesota-developed basic skills test, and we were able to get statute changed to provide some more flexibility so that we can recognize other types of tests. And I think that will make it easier for individuals who are coming from out of state to be able to become licensed in Minnesota faster. That has been one thing that we have heard, is that people coming from outside of the state are having a hard time becoming licensed in Minnesota because of some of our statutory and policy requirements. We're also improving our data collection process. You know, as I mentioned, we did have a lot of data, but we did see that there were some gaps in the data that we are collecting. So we are making some updates to the systems that districts use to provide us teaching, staffing data. So that some of those things are moving forward, but again, we think that this one strategy will benefit the entire state and our teaching workforce. So we admit we have a lot more to do, but we're committed to implementing this strategy. So with that, those were the two strategies that we wanted to highlight, and thank you for joining us.
Thank you very much, Hui and Greg. We're going to move very quickly from the northern Midwest in Minnesota to the Southwest in Arizona. I want to remind folks that you can enter your questions in the chat box. We will have a Q&A session after Arizona's presentation, but if you have questions for Hui and Greg or for Marianne, you can enter them now, and we will gather them together and post them and get them into the Q&A. Today from Arizona, we have Dr. Cecilia Johnson and Mark McCall. Dr. Johnson is the Associate Superintendent of Highly Effective Teachers and Leaders at the Arizona Department of Education. She oversees multiple program areas there, including certification and educator evaluation, Title II, and professional learning. Dr. Johnson has more than 20 years of experience in public education as a teacher, principal, curriculum director, and superintendent. Mark McCall is the Deputy Associate Superintendent of Educator Excellence at the Arizona Department of Education. He has 20 years of experience in education also, working as a middle school history and geography teacher as well as an instructional coach and school administrator. So we're very lucky to have Cecilia and Mark here to speak with us today. So thanks for joining us, and welcome, Cecilia and Mark.
Thank you. We're happy to be here. And welcome, everyone. First, we want to talk a little bit about the demographics of our students in Arizona. We have approximately 1.1 million students in our state, and this graphic breaks down our percentages, with our largest percent being our Hispanic at 44%, white is close at 43%, and then we have our Native American at 5%, and our Black at 5%, and then our Asian at 3%. Students by poverty shows that we have 89% in our remote area. 89% of our students in remote areas are on free and reduced lunch. We call remote our geographically, it's our border areas, many of which are reservations. 71% of our rural areas are on free and reduced lunch. Our urban areas, which consist of really our two big areas of Phoenix and Tucson, and then we also have in the northern part of our state Flagstaff, and the southern part of our state Yuma. So those are really considered our four urban areas. And then when you add that all together, all Arizona students, we're at about 48% that are on identified as poverty. The demographics about our Arizona schools, we have approximately 255 districts and 400 charter holders. We have 2,121 schools. As I stated before, about 1.1 million students, over 60,000 K-12 teachers. The national average beginning teacher salary is a little over 36,000. In Arizona, it's not quite 32,000. We have quite a bit of discussion going on, particularly with the poverty level for a family of 4 is at 36,000. So our average beginning teacher salaries are below the poverty level. Our average annual per pupil spending nationally is a little over 11,000, and you'll look at Arizona that we are about 7,500. And yes, we are 50th in the state on our spending per pupil. On our teacher effectiveness ratings, we have 29% highly effective and 62% at effective. So our data is showing about 90% of our teachers are effective. These are self-reporting data. We have local control in Arizona, and so the data is collected by LEAs inputting that data in our system. We have 7% at developing and 2% at ineffective. When we look at our out-of-field and our non-highly qualified teachers, we are at about 9%. The reason that's what we consider a little bit high is because of our current teacher shortage situation. We actually consider we're in a crisis situation. Those non-highly qualified teachers, while some of them are in charter schools where they could be highly qualified but not certified in our state, a lot of that are substitutes and long-term substitutes. When school started, at about 3 weeks in, we did a survey of all of our LEAs. We had a little over 100 districts responding that they still had 82% of our districts still had openings, teacher openings, which means they are using substitutes for those positions. When you look at our inexperienced teachers, we're at about 20%, and those are our teachers that have 3 years or less. we are getting ready to see about a 25% turnover in the next 5 years of retirees.
So when we calculated our equity gaps, we took a look at it from two different ways. We looked at our economically disadvantaged and of course ranked at quartile 1 through quartile 4, with quartile 1 being the students of the highest SES, with quartile 4 being the lowest SES. And then we also recalculated with students of color. The reason we calculated it twice in looking at all of our LEAs across the state is that in the data that's reported to the OCR data that we received from the federal government, we noticed that some schools reported only their free and reduced lunch but not their minority status, and some reported minority status but not a free and reduced lunch, although the majority of schools did report both, and so we were able to have the data. But when we initially calculated this, we were discovering we were not seeing this bigger issue until we recalculated twice and saw we had specific issues with the economically disadvantaged and then recalculating for students of color as we were going through. So you can see that consistent with the national research, we have more students in quartile 4, the more economically disadvantaged students, being taught by inexperienced teachers and also by teachers rated as developing or ineffective at a higher rate than those in quartile 1. So we have that consistent gap, which is what the federal government has asked us to look at. What we found very interesting in looking at the out-of-field and non-highly qualified teachers was actually at the economically disadvantaged level, it was actually a negative equity gap of -0.7%. So it was almost negligible. We attribute a lot of that to, as Cecilia was talking about, the number of charter schools and what we have in Arizona with our local control of charter schools and some very diverse policies for charter schools that allow non-certified teachers, unless they're working with special ed students, to be working at the charter school. So we're attributing that in a little more affluent area of the charter schools, looking at less of a gap, an almost non-existent gap. We also did calculate teacher absenteeism, but what we noticed that it was consistent across all the quartiles, that our state average of about 25 to 30% absenteeism was consistent that each quartile was around 25 to 30%. So we didn't see that as a significant enough gap to be listing in our plan as far as an equity gap goes. However, it is data that we use, and I'm going to refer to in a little bit later, in talking about where we went to our root cause analysis and our key concerns, because we consider the perception of the profession to be one of those bigger issues, and the absenteeism might be data that supports this negative perception of the field. So that takes us to looking at the equity concerns that we looked at. So like Minnesota talked about, we also did stakeholder meetings across the state. We held 15 statewide stakeholder meetings. We also held a statewide webinar as we were getting ready to submit our plan for the first time. Those stakeholder meetings were in every geographic region around the state, and we didn't want to focus just on our main urban areas because politically in Arizona, folks tend to complain that we always focus on just what the urban areas may want. And we actually got some really great information as we went out to our rural and remote, and we got a lot more actually parent information from the stakeholders as we went out to the remote areas, because concerns for where they're looking for highly effective teachers and just retaining and recruiting teachers to those areas are very, very important to the parents in those communities. So we were getting great information from folks as we went out and did these stakeholder meetings. Arizona is a local control state, and we're a big supporter of local control. So what we were seeing as we were coming back and looking at our root cause analysis, we were seeing consistent messages that you see on the screen there that we boiled down to our 3 equity concerns coming from each of these regions in our stakeholder meetings. And we're looking at the possibility that our evaluation ratings may not accurately reflect actual classroom instruction. We perceive this to be because districts are allowed to develop or choose their own evaluation systems as long as they align to the INTASC standards. The districts are also allowed to add to those instruments any sort of weighting or emphasis to a given element. There's no uniform rating scale, and they can also add their own elements to the instruments to kind of add on additional pieces of data for them to be measuring. That information is then self-reported back to our department as a record keeping, but we look at, as you saw on one of the previous slides, about 90% of our teachers are rated as effective and highly effective, but then we see a disconnect between student achievement and our statewide accountability data. So that raised our question that perhaps what we're seeing in our evaluation ratings is not accurately reflecting the instruction that we're seeing. The other two concerns there are closely linked in difficulty retaining and recruiting highly effective teachers, and also an overall negative perception of the profession. We've seen things coming from the media, and I'm sure we're seeing this nationally as well. We're seeing that the media is presenting perhaps one side of the story when it comes to certain statistics. There are anecdotal stories that are coming out from teachers within the field talking about difficulties they're having, but also other folks who are saying, I don't want to go into the profession, or I would never allow my child to go into the profession, things like that. We're also seeing, coming from our legislature, continual budget cuts, as is everybody, but those budget cuts are hitting in really difficult ways across the whole state, where we even had one district who, in trying to retain teacher salaries, ended up closing schools and furloughing some of their administrative staff and actually cutting up to 24% of their administrative staff, just in ways to try to be creative to keep effective teachers in the classroom. So the impact doesn't just hit teachers, but it impacts our whole community, and then economically, of course, impacts the quality of education being delivered. We're also seeing our universities are reporting a decline of as much as 26% of enrollment in their teacher prep programs. And our districts, particularly in southern Arizona, are seeing considerable turnovers of teachers, and we'll show some data on our next slide. We're seeing as much as 19% turnover each year in our southern Arizona districts, particularly along the Arizona-Mexico border. So in looking at strategies that we were considering for how are we going to address those three concerns, we had to look at all the equity data, of course, and then we looked at some other data that comes together for where we're seeing the profession in Arizona. So as Cecilia mentioned, we started the year with approximately 1,000 vacancies just in the teaching classroom. There were also administrative vacancies. We saw that our university systems the students that they're graduating are only able to fill about 50% of the need of each year's teacher turnover. As I said, the public universities in Arizona are reporting a 26% decline in enrollment in their colleges of education. Our urban schools have resources available to them through different means, but they're facing the challenges of just urban poverty and all the social issues that go with that. And so teachers are finding it difficult to be successful in those conditions for a variety of different reasons beyond just the classroom or funding concerns. And then our rural and our remote schools are struggling even to just attract quality teachers, and then once they do attract highly effective teachers, to retain them beyond more than 1 or 2 years. We know that nationally our statistics show that 46% of teachers leave within the first 4 years, but in Arizona our data is showing a little more drastic, that 24% of our first-year teachers and 20% of our second-year teachers have left the profession altogether within that time as they're moving forward. So going back to our previous slide where we talked about over 10,000 of our teachers are listed as inexperienced, that's a number that's going to continue to grow as our teachers leave, and we try to fill that. We're going to be continually filling with inexperienced teachers. So continuing with the data and the kind of anecdotal rationale we wanted for proposed strategies, Cecilia is going to take us through that part.
Part of the work that was aligned with our Educator Equity Plan was a task force that was started in our agency a couple of years ago. We call the Educator Retention and Recruitment Task Force. It's made up of various stakeholders. We have HR directors, superintendents, higher ed representatives, parent group representatives, teachers. So we have a variety of members of the Educator Retention and Recruitment Task Force. This task force published their first white paper in January of this year, and we're getting ready to publish our second white paper, and we're going to focus more on action plans which align with our Educator Equity Plan. What's interesting that we discovered, frequently nationally we talk about recruitment and retention, but in Arizona we really focus on retention and recruitment because we need to retain our effective and highly effective staff, so we have less turnover. Part of the research we did was both nationally and regionally and locally. When we looked at 5 reasons teachers leave the profession, in the top 5 reasons, all across the nation is administration. They leave because of their administrators, the school climate, and lack of resources and support. So we really want to focus on the retention and our educator effectiveness. We have a three-pronged approach. We're looking at fortifying the top, so looking at leadership development, strengthening the middle, which is teacher leadership, and equipping the entry level, which is our beginning teacher mentoring and induction program and structured support. Under leadership development, we've started a first-year superintendent collaborative network. We're beginning to start a new principal institute, a new assistant principal institute, providing this leadership support with coaches and mentoring. And we're really focusing not only on the management piece of being a building level administrator, but looking at how do you develop positive school climate, how do you build a culture of change, and then how do you lead through change? So we're looking at some of the pieces that teachers are saying are the reasons they leave the profession. We also are helping our administrators effectively implement an evaluation system. And we're looking at how to help them build teacher leader opportunities so that they have a distributive leadership model.
And with those teacher leadership models that we're looking at, we're trying to address the need of messages that we're hearing from teachers who want to advance in their career and want to take on more leadership opportunities, but don't necessarily want to move into administration or move into a traditional leadership role that might take them out of the classroom. So we're exploring some different creative models, including some of the work being done by Public Impact and their work with the opportunity culture models. We also want to be looking at how do we strengthen and encourage more teachers to be looking at the National Board Certification, and then also looking at that kind of instructional coaching role, strengthening those roles that currently exist and providing more leadership opportunities, but also still allowing them to be connected to students in the classroom. We also took a look at the issue with our beginning teachers, and while there are some successful programs that some districts have implemented and some of the universities have provided some support with, we don't have a statewide model, although we do have statewide standards to support beginning mentoring induction programs. So one of the things that we're looking at is building an effective beginning teacher mentoring and induction program that would provide support for teachers with ongoing job-embedded professional learning, providing support networks with coaching, mentoring, the teacher leaders, and also other teachers within the field that they can connect with. Social media support, looking at how do we leverage all of the things that this current millennial generation is asking for. And with that, that brings us to really the end of where we were looking for our plan. We have submitted our plan and we've received comments for feedback, and we have one more revision opportunity that we'll be submitting again with some minor technical revisions that they've asked for us to do. But we're confident in where we're moving forward, and with that, Cecilia and I thank you.
Thank you so much. We're happy now to entertain questions and continue this dialogue.
Great. Well, this is Marianne, and I want to thank all of our presenters from the states. We have gotten a few questions from the audience, and I would like to maybe start with one for Minnesota. Wei or Greg, the question is, what sub-strategies did you implement in Minnesota to address institutional racism? Could you talk a little bit more about that?
I think the first thing I'd say is it'd probably be extremely generous to say that we have addressed institutional racism, because this is really the start to our work around that. I believe that one of the things that emerged in this whole process was that we haven't really engaged in even many conversations as a state about equity and racism. And so really the things that we've done now, maybe by some of the states on the line, pretty fundamental in terms of looking for and establishing partnerships is one thing that we've started in the past few months. One of the things that we found is we don't even have common definitions for words like racism and equity as a state, and so One of the things that we've been working on is just creating a common language, creating shared definitions, so that we can even engage in a conversation about racism and about equity. Another thing that we've done that's been, sounds easy but has been pretty difficult, has been just naming institutional racism as something that we need to work on and putting it in the forefront and even including it in our conversations at a high level. I think the most practical thing that we have started doing, at least in my work, is we've looked for entry points in every strategy, every tool that we use with districts and schools, and we've looked for how equity and racism can be worked into that tool. So a good example is we have a coaching model that we use. In my division, we do teacher evaluation, we do our teacher quality program, we do alternative teacher pay, we do school support for folks in priority schools, we do the regional centers, and we have one common coaching model that's across all of those programs. And there was nothing explicit about equity and racism in that coaching model. So in all of our tools and that complement that coaching model, we looked at every question and we looked for entry points for, questions about equity and questions about racism. So that's a pretty practical thing that we've done, but most of the work to date has been pretty fundamental of just even creating a venue to have the conversation successfully. So thank you.
That's great. Thank you. I think there are actually two questions here for Cecilia or Mark from Arizona. One question is just a question of clarification. I think you mentioned a program related to teacher leadership, and if you could just repeat the information about the program that you mentioned, that would be great. And then a second question is around alternative licensure, and to what extent that's related to perhaps plans to try to address equity gaps.
Sure. So we're looking at a variety of different research-based models that are out there. One that we've done some work with most recently is the opportunity culture model that's put up by Public Impact. And so I'm posting it right there at publicimpact.org. And then Cecilia is going to answer our licensure question.
Yes, we do have an alternative program for licensure. So it requires that the person have a baccalaureate degree, bachelor's degree. Then they would get a position with a district at the same time that they're enrolled in a post-bac program that can last 1 or 2 years, that provides them the pedagogy. And that's been very successful. And many districts are able to employ folks that have the content knowledge in their bachelor's but did not necessarily get the teaching pedagogy, and also those that are doing a re-career or second career opportunity. And that program is expanding as more and more districts are looking for ways to fill their positions.
Great, thank you. Wei and Greg, a question for you. How will you know if the strategies that you are implementing are working? What will your process be to adapt them, and how do you continue to plan to engage stakeholders as you implement?
We are one of the things that we're currently working on once our plan was approved was putting together academic teams that work in the specific areas that are represented in our plan. So these are cross-agency teams that are really at a smaller scale than the teams that Wei talked about earlier in terms of putting the plan together. So for example, we have one cross-agency team that also involves stakeholders that works only on strategy 2, which is the regional centers. And so those particular teams involve the stakeholders at the implementation level. Also, each team is coming up with a program evaluation based on sort of the overarching program evaluation that is in our overall equity plan. So currently we're working on that related to each individual strategy. We've done a lot of, are currently doing a lot of work around that in identifying what data we'll track to monitor effort, fidelity of implementation, and then impact. So we've just started that process. And that process will also engage our stakeholders, we hope.
Great, thanks. Both states mentioned funding and being able to carry out the various strategies that you'd like to. And Cecilia or Mark, I wonder if you could talk about, have you identified any particular funding sources to support implementation of strategies?
Well, we certainly are using existing funding sources, our state allocations and then grant funds, and what we're working on is prioritizing. So reallocate your funds on the areas of the most need. So helping folks look at ways to do that, particularly on Title II, how they're able to repurpose their Title II and make sure that they're targeting and focusing their professional learning funds in the areas of most need. We also are working with our universities, doing partnerships with them, and also private and public partnerships. We've gotten business support in our stakeholder and advisory councils, but also for them to help us financially support and partner with some of these initiatives.
Great, thanks. Greg or Wei, would you want to add anything to that from Minnesota's point of view?
We primarily use state funding. I think Wei identified between the two of us that we got about $1.5 million per year in this biennium to support some of the strategies. A lot of the regional center work, which was the vehicle for a lot of our teacher equity work, are also funded with some existing state funding that we've been getting for about 3 years. A lot of the schools that were contributing most to the gaps we identified in access to good teachers was in our focus and priority schools. We use federal funds, Title I funds, to support that work. And so we do use some federal funding, but it's mostly existing state funding. And we tried really to go for state funding because we wanted to create some sustainability for these strategies.
Great, thank you. In the questions that we got while people were registering for this webinar, and I don't know if those folks are on the phone, there were a number of individuals who had interest in English language learners. And so I wonder, Mark or Cecilia, if you could talk about whether or not you looked at data related to English language learners and if there were equity gaps and issues related to quality of teachers providing services to ELL students.
Yes, we've been able to, through legislation, have a strong impact on our meeting the needs of our ELL students. Due to some legislation and some legal settlements in Arizona, all of our teachers are required to have an SEI endorsement, structured English immersion endorsement. So every one of our certified educators, both teachers and administrators, go through a course, 45 hours to 90 hours, on how to use effective strategies with our ELL students. So we're pretty confident that every single one of our teachers has the ability and the training to work with our ELL students, either in the classroom where they would be on an individual language learning plan, ILLP, or if they're in self-contained classrooms where they get anywhere from 2 to 4 hours of intensive English language instruction. So we have a pretty solid model, and our data is showing very positive results in moving our English language learners into being fully language competent.
Great, thank you. to come back to Minnesota, another question is related to rural districts. So you mentioned, a lot of times people think about poverty in particular in your urban areas, but there's quite a bit of poverty in rural areas as well. Do you have any districts that have overcome challenges related to recruiting and retaining excellent teachers? Do you have any stories that you could share about how they might have done that?
When we looked at, so I'm going to, the retaining excellent teachers, first of all, when we looked at the data, just rural districts in general, we did not find that there was a retention gap. Rural districts were pretty successful in being able to retain teachers. And even some of our rural districts that have high minority populations actually did not experience a lot of teacher turnover. We did find that charter schools were an area that where retention was an issue, and we identified that salary inequities were probably the biggest piece there. So we haven't solved that problem yet. The recruitment it's not one that we've overcome. In fact, that's a growing problem in our state in terms of rural districts being able to recruit teachers to fill positions. And I think I understood Arizona to share that dilemma. So no, we haven't overcome those challenges or found many districts that have been able to overcome recruitment challenges just because the pool of new teachers is so shallow.
Cecilia or Mark, from Arizona's perspective, do you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, we sure can. We have a couple of, it's rare, but we have a couple of instances. Part of, as you would know, the challenge of course recruiting to rural and our remote areas is our remote areas, specifically the Native American reservations in the northeastern part of our state, are hours and hours away from an urban area. So they have some success in getting first year or second year teachers there right out of the universities who want that experience of teaching in a Native American setting and trying to make an impact that way. But then they're challenged because they're so far away from social networks and things like that, is they just don't stay, and then they go to places like Flagstaff or Phoenix or Tucson that pay better. I can speak to a couple of districts that I know. One of them is right on the border. Actually, both of them are right on the border with Mexico. One has had success in that the superintendent there has kind of reallocated her priorities and pays better than the other neighboring districts, which of course is a bone of contention for the other neighboring districts, but she's made salary work for them, and that helps retain her teachers there. The other one is also right on the border. It's over in the Yuma area, and it speaks to leadership development and systems-wide thinking. They have a superintendent who is very, very strong. He's well supported by the community, and he gets teachers and he supports them, and he puts programs in place that move kids along academically, and people want to work in that district and they want to stay there, versus the other neighboring districts in that area that have some different challenges with just kind of implementing programs but have the same sort of demographics and funding, but he makes it work. So I think speaking to the solution of there's a funding question, but speaking to your leadership development is really the kind of place to start with as you're moving things through. And then that helps with systemic culture and changing your culture moving forward.
Great, thank you. One follow-up question for you folks in Arizona is, one of the things that you mentioned, and I know that it's something that comes up for lots of states, is an issue of local control. And so given that you're at the state level writing a plan related to improving equity, but lots of the factors that really dictate whether or not students have access to excellent teachers happen at the local level. How are you thinking about that issue and supporting LEAs and so on?
I think the biggest piece is we all have the commonality of providing the most effective educators for all of our students. So when we look at local control, we take the promising practices and the best practices and provide them the information and technical support for whatever way they choose. For example, when it comes to our evaluation system, we probably have hundreds of different evaluation systems in our 600 and plus LEAs, but they're all based on the in-test standards and follow the board-approved framework. So we find the areas that it's common, and then they build in their own cultural perspectives. But that has helped us work with them because of the pieces that align with multiple LEAs, and then they add their own particular unique and cultural focus and vision and mission.
Great, thank you. Greg or Wade, did you want to add anything to that?
I think the only thing, definitely everything that was just said, the only thing I would add is we have tried to leverage, we feel like we have a lot of local control as well in Minnesota, and we have found a leverage point is in creating some common priorities across the state. With equity and elimination of achievement gaps having been one of ours for many years, this teacher equity work is, a subset of that conversation. So, even in a context of local control, I think you can create some common galvanizing issues that all of you are working towards, and we've definitely tried to do that, and then embed all the work underneath some of those handful of issues that we've tried to create a statewide emphasis on, even in the context of local control.
Great, thank you. That ends our Q&A part of the conversation for today, and I think we'll now turn to looking at resources, and if we have any time at the end, we can certainly turn back to questions. So I wanted to talk a little bit about some of the resources that have been developed, both to help in the development of equity plans and strategies, and then also that will be available related to implementation. And so the Center on Great Teachers and Leaders already developed what we call an Equitable Access Toolkit that has a number of different resources which really were aimed at helping states to develop their equity plans. And so most states have already written those plans and submitted those plans to the U.S. Department of Education. But these resources are still available if you are an LEA or if you're interested in these kinds of tools as you're developing other kinds of plans. They are still available online, and there are tools related to looking at data about equity. There are tools related to doing root cause analysis and engaging with stakeholders and so on. And this is just an example of one of those tools, the Moving Toward Equity tool, which sort of walks you through a process of thinking about how to design a plan related to equitable access. There are a number of other GTL Center resources that I just wanted to draw to your attention, and these really relate to strategies and root causes. So in addition to resources specific to equity plan development, we've got a number of other resources that relate to talent management in general. So if you're interested, for example, in a specific topic related to recruitment or retention, we do have resources available on those types of things, and you'll see some examples of the types of things that we have here, including things around working conditions as well. So I'd encourage you to take a look at those if you're interested in more information on different strategies related to equitable access. There are a number of tools that are under development now, and these are going to be available towards the end of October or very early November. And these are going to relate to implementation of the plan. So it's great to have an equity plan, but then of course you've got to carry that equity plan out. And so we've been hard at work in developing some resources that will relate specifically to implementation. And I'll just quickly talk about what those tools will look like. One is a planning tool, and it's really about how to think about project managing around your plan. And so it's a fairly useful tool from that point of view in terms of just thinking about management of your plan and thinking about monitoring. The second tool is a guidebook, and this will really be related to communication. So one of the goals of the plans, of course, in addition to reducing equity gaps. But part of the strategy behind the plans is that they would engage with stakeholders and that the public would be informed not only about equity gaps, but about strategies to reduce those equity gaps. And so one of the other tools we're developing is related to communication and how to get information out there and galvanize folks to really get interested and engaged in this issue of equity. A third tool is related to creating coherence, and this follows up on some of the comments that our state presenters made related to making sure that the equity plans that are being laid out can be integrated into existing initiatives so that it isn't just another set of things that either the state or others have to do, but that it really is coherent with other initiatives that are already going on in education. The fourth tool is a monitoring tool, and this really focuses more specifically on monitoring implementation. So how do you know if you're getting what you want out of your strategies, and how do you continue to engage with stakeholders during that process? And then the last tool is an LEA implementation guide for districts. And so here again, knowing that many of the issues that relate to equitable access are really sort of the rubber meets the road at the local level, there'll be some guidance here for how to support LEAs in developing their own plans if they are required or wish to do so, or how to implement strategies that will be relevant to the overall state equity plan. And as I mentioned, those will become available late October or early November. The last resource that I wanted to mention is that, as I said at the beginning of the webinar, there is a network of organizations called the Equitable Access Support Network that is designed to provide technical assistance around these equity plans and the follow-up related to implementation of those plans. They have developed a number of communities of practice, which are online. Some are topic specific, that give some space for SEAs and technical assistance providers to ask questions, to share resources, to learn about new information that's out there. And so if you're interested, if you're not a member of one of those communities of practice and you're interested in becoming one, you can visit the website that's listed on this slide here and request access. And some of the topics that they've been discussing recently are really related to implementation and thinking about how this equity plan initiative will play out at the local level. And I'm going to turn it back to our REL colleagues to talk a little bit about how the RELs see themselves in supporting the work related to equitable access.
Hi, I'm Liz Barkowski, and I'm a researcher with the REL Southwest, and I'd like to provide a couple examples of how the REL supports states and districts with their equity plans. And I'm going to provide some examples from here in REL Southwest. So this last winter or spring, our researchers worked with the Texas Education Agency to analyze existing state data to investigate the equitable distribution of teachers in Texas. This work helped the state identify gaps and explore root causes as to why these gaps might exist. And this work was the starting point for building the state's equity plan. REL Southwest recently proposed 2 additional studies to further investigate equitable access in Texas. The first study aims to describe the mobility or movement of teachers from states or from school districts across the state and examine any relationships between teacher mobility and school characteristics. The second study will look at teacher supply and demand to determine whether there are disparities across the state in the supply and demand of teachers. REL West and Midwest will also conduct similar studies looking at issues including teacher mobility, supply and demand, and projected teacher retirement. Other RELs offer similar support to states and school districts, so if you're interested in learning more, please contact your REL. Most of the RELs have equitable access or educator effectiveness research alliances that do most of this work. Most of those alliances have a primary contact or liaison. Reno is the contact for REL West. Patricia Balana is the contact for REL Midwest and REL Southwest. So again, if you're interested in learning more, please contact them directly. Thanks.
So that wraps up today's webinar, but before everyone logs off, I wanted to remind folks if they could please fill out the stakeholder feedback survey, that the link is in the chat box below the PowerPoint that you're looking at. Jackie has posted it. And we get a lot of quality, we base a lot of our work on what we hear from those feedback surveys, so they actually are influencing a lot of what we do. So if we can get you to please fill that out, it would be very beneficial for us. And otherwise, I wanted to thank everyone for joining us. I want to thank our presenters. I think it was a valuable discussion, interactive discussion, and I hope folks benefited from it. So on my behalf, I wanted to just give some contact information for both Patricia and myself. We are both the primary contacts for educator effectiveness in our two regions. So we are happy to follow up with folks who have additional questions or would like to explore things in different ways. So thank you very much for joining us today, and we hope to talk again with many folks on these issues. Take care.